Welcome to Grow Bites. I'm Richard Steele. Our guest today is Tim Gough, Pioneer Director of Youth for Christ in Wales. He's the editor of the Grove book, Youth Ministry Online, using social media platforms to connect with teenagers. Grove Bites presenter Alex Guest talked to him about the fast-moving digital world, where it's important to keep up. Zoom, YouTube, TikTok and Instagram are all explored for their value in working with teenagers. Facebook, the domain for rather older generations, is not featured. The choices in this book are governed by what young people are using today.
In the last 18 months, we've seen a move away from Snapchat, which is one of the big ones. That's why it's not in the book. We're seeing a move towards things like Twitch, which is more gaming. So I do think there is a shelf life to a lot of these social media platforms. It's more about the sense of community and communication behind them. And just like fashion, they move and change trend quite quickly.
Absolutely. And some of us will have become much more familiar with church online and using some of those platforms, particularly Zoom and YouTube. Now, I wonder if you could give us some insight. What's distinctive about youth work on those platforms? So where there is a crossover and we're familiar with church happening, why is it different to the task of engaging with young people?
Yeah, I mean, YouTube's an interesting one because it is the largest consumed piece of digital media out there. I mean, young people are consuming YouTube at an alarming rate. Not just young people. You said you're on the crossover generation between Gen Z and millennial. I'm firmly a millennial, and I love YouTube. I can spend hours watching puppies play and pandas sneezing on YouTube. But it's a platform that young people are spending hours not just consuming but participating in. They can become content creators. And so YouTube is probably a little bit more of a lasting entity than a lot of the others are, and maybe needs to be treated separately because young people are suddenly leveling the playing field and saying, I've got something to say. My phone camera is pretty good and I'm going to put content out there. And that raises a whole bunch of challenges, safeguarding issues, but also it raises great opportunities because young people, we want to get them involved. We want to get them creative and participating. And it's a great platform to do that. Zoom's very different. Zoom is weird. Um, it, as much as we think of young people as digital natives, which is a bit of a strange term anyway, they're not native to video conferencing. Zoom is something that we're all learning and young people are learning too. And young people have never had to, unless they're homeschooled, have never really done digital learning environments, live digital video conferencing learning environments. So Zoom is something which has not been created with young people in mind. It's much more like a blank room that we have to fill with youth-friendly apparatus. And we're still learning the best way to do that at the moment. But yeah, very different platforms with different needs for young people, but both of them great fun and great opportunities.
And you highlight there the importance of participation. And one of your colleagues speaks about the distinction between hot and cold media. Do you want to just give us an explanation briefly of what that is?
Yeah, that's Andy. In the first chapter, he wrote the intro, which is great because what he did was say, here is a few basic principles that cover all the social media platforms before the other guys get into actually using them. And I'm just looking up the bit he said here because he titled it something brilliant. He titled it "Stay Frosty."
Yeah, I thought that was a new piece of slang that I hadn't quite picked up on yet.
Yeah. No, I bet this is just Andy being Andy. And if you read anything he's written, in fact, I do highly recommend read his book, Looking Good Naked, which came out last year. Don't Google it for reasons. But he's got a great book on the church and young people, which even though we're not meeting with like physical ecclesiology right now, it's a great book to get into some of these questions. So I'll read you a little bit of what he said, because he'll say it better than I'll say it. Hot media engages a single sense in high definition, like YouTube, Spotify, something where you are being bombarded with something that's basically pro-edited and it's engaging a single sense. You don't have to work hard. You can put it on the background. You can listen to it while you're doing something else. But cold media is much more Zoom. It's much more interactive, something that demands something from them. So he says, stay frosty. Don't just focus on the hot media. Think about cold media. Think about experiencing something, communicating, participating with the young people. And that's where traditionally we've not used social media. Mostly we've used social media for hot media. We've given them video content or advertised something. And actually cold media is where the action really is, which is when do we have real interaction with young people.
Yes, and of course the gospel is all about building relationship, and that requires participation. So I think Andy goes on to talk about Jesus using it sometimes when he delivers sermons or miracles or healing. He describes that as hot media, and then he speaks about other forms that are cold media. And I would say the heart. It seems a bit counterintuitive to say at the heart of it, the gospel is cold. But there's a sense of participation. Do you think that's becoming a real challenge because of the pandemic, or has that always been the challenge and the battle that we face with young people in different generations?
I think that's always the battle. I think so the last book I wrote was about youth work history and charting the last sort of 40 to 60 years of youth work in the West, and how it really came about as this missional response to young people leaving the church in droves. And a lot of what we did then was just presentation. And when you go through from the 60s to the 80s, all of a sudden the youth worker was the guy up on the stage. By the late 80s and the 90s, you had the festivals take over. And all of a sudden, youth work was very much presentation driven, entertainment, consumer driven. And there's a place for that. But if that's the DNA of our youth work, and it has been for so long, it's really hard to convince youth workers to draw young people into real participation. And I don't mean token participation. I don't mean, okay, you can click the button and do the slides at the front of church, or we'll give you a microphone and you can sing, but we probably won't turn the microphone on. Just real participation means responsibility. It means getting them preaching. It means getting them involved with the actual heartbeat of the church. It means getting them into your PCC boards and eldership meetings. It means giving young people real responsibility. And it's hard enough doing that. It's hard enough doing that in everyday life anyway, when people write young people off as not quite ready yet. And it's hard enough for youth leaders who have spent the last 60 years doing youth leading from the front. And now it's even harder when they're not even in the room with you. But hey, we're all innovators and we're here to have a good go at it. So hopefully we can use this time to reboot some of that and crack on.
And sounds like a real opportunity for the young people to become the leaders in these on these social media platforms, where someone like I don't really know that much about TikTok, and actually allowing them to have the lead on it so that they become the teachers in that context, I think is really important.
Yeah.
Something I think that some leaders may be a little bit apprehensive of regarding social media is this idea of trends and online culture. And of course, we've got that, especially evangelicals, we have this idea that we're called to be countercultural. I think that's the call of all Christians, but particularly within evangelical circles, you hear that kind of drummed into you. And this idea of buying into the online trends, particularly on TikTok, does it become just a kind of a novelty, and does it turn the gospel into something of a novelty, do you think?
I think it certainly can do. I mean, novelty is like skipping a stone across a pond. At some point it stops and it sinks. I think we do have to build something more lasting than that. I mean, trends can be a very useful tool in that first engagement with young people. So using an up-to-date hashtag means you're going to connect with a wide number of young people who are engaging on that hashtag. But if I say hashtag, but even hashtags are disappearing now. So whatever we want to use for that. But yeah, you can be on trend to a certain degree. But I think when you get past that initial communication, you do need to go deeper. And I've always had problems with this word relevancy. Now, I've been a youth worker my whole adult life, and I'm 34 now, and relevancy's been this word which has come up in every book I've read and every training session I've ever been to. Is we've got to be relevant. And usually what people mean by the word relevant is be on trend, shop at the same shops, watch the same box sets, read the same books, listen to the same music, and all of that surface level. And it's okay to do that as a starting conversation, but real relevancy is relevancy to humanity. I mean, storytellers are always relevant because we all love a good story. People who are vulnerable and admit that they have anxiety and fear are relevant because we're engaging at that level of humanity. People who understand original sin and the nature of the power of the gospel that speaks into every generation, they're relevant people. And so I think we've got to say, okay, trends and relevancy is a great tool, but it's not where the meat is. And the problem, if all you do is push on trend, you will broaden your number of young people, but you won't deepen their relationship with Christ. And one of the things I want to push people on right now is don't try and reach the masses online, because frankly, there are charities probably doing that better than you can, better than I can. Things like Intro Outro, which is Youth for Christ's main YouTube channel, they are equipped for the masses, but they're not equipped for local work in the way that we are. And you can still do local digital work with a group of 6 young people for 6 months and do miraculous ministry with them in a way you couldn't do if you were constantly focused on the trend setting. That was a long answer, wasn't it? Sorry.
No, brilliant. And I think it ends just where I wanted, this idea of being equipped. There's a real kind of insecurity amongst church leaders that I speak to at the moment, because you are bombarded and exposed to all of these churches and their services in a way that we wouldn't usually be exposed to them. You know, I know about some of the large churches, I know they have bigger worship bands, but suddenly we're all exposed, and all of our vulnerabilities, our capabilities are exposed for everyone to see online. So we begin to look at other services, other churches, and say, well, they've got all of these fancy countdowns going on and we haven't got that, and I don't know how they're switching from one house to another, and they've got this great worship leader and I don't have that. So some of us don't feel equipped or resourced for some of the mission and ministry that others are engaging with. So I think what you're saying is that actually work with what you do have is sufficient and is good and still has integrity. And I think particularly that power to be miraculous.
Yes.
Is great to hear.
I think you're absolutely right. And of course, the problem with all having exposure to all these different churches is it increases unhealthy habits like church shopping and playing the comparison game. And if I might just very quickly indulge in some mathematics, I'm terrible at maths, so I enjoy this. If I, as a youth worker, spent the next 50 years of my life speaking to huge crowds of young people, and every year saw 50 young people come to Christ, it'd be amazing. It'd be 1,500 kids come to Jesus, size of a school. But if instead I spent 2 years focusing on just 3 young people and teaching them to do the same, 2 things would happen. The first thing would happen is I'd get fired, because 3 young people is a rubbish youth group. But the second thing that would happen is you'd see the entire population of the earth saved in half my lifetime. At some point you go, why are we wasting our time trying to create a big en masse crowd event for everybody when there's enough of us living Christians right now who could really do deep generational, local, personal, community-driven work with a small number? And if we all did it, church suddenly starts working, mission suddenly starts working. So of course you can have 4 young people on a Zoom meeting every week with no band and no lights and no crazy gizmos. As long as you do it consistently, you lead with the gospel and you build community and you show that you care, I think it can work.
That sounds phenomenal. Exciting, really good advice as well for those of us who are leading churches and tearing out our hairs, quite frankly.
That's why I've got a hat on, all my hair's still out.
Do you see post-pandemic, if there ever is such a thing? Obviously, we won't be reverting or abandoning our digital workspaces and social media platforms. How do you see that changing and the challenges in the next stage of life for these young people, especially?
Yeah, it's weird, isn't it? If you want to try to measure the emotional tone of a lot of adults today, it does seem like anger and rage and frustration seems to be that emotional tone. But when you look at young people, what that emotional tone of adults is creating in them is just fear. I mean, arguably that's what's driving the adults too, but I think young people are just frightened. They're just afraid. And a lot of the work we're doing right now with young people needs to meet that very specific carnal human issue of young people are just afraid. And who knows what's going to happen next. And we need to start creating safe spaces that do that. And that has to bleed into the next generation. I think assuming that when this is over, we'll just take up where we left off is bonkers. The world has changed. And we don't even talk about the new normal now, because who knows what any kind of normal truly is. I think what we really want to do right now is say, okay, young people are afraid. We've got this nasty habit of making them more afraid. What can we do right now which creates a safe place for them to meet the secure, permanent, fatherly love of God that will continue into whatever the new phase of youth work and ministry will be? I do not believe youth work in the future will look like it has before. And if we try and make it work that way, we'll find that young people have evolved and they've moved on without us. I think if we can start by saying they're afraid, they need Christ, let's do that online in such a tonal way it will work with whatever we do afterwards. I think we'll be on the right track.
You'll find far more than just technical advice in youth ministry online. And as well as Tim himself, the book contains contributions from Andy Defer of Moorlands College, Tim Alford of Limitless, Benjamin Cutting of Youth for Christ, Sara Taylor of Urban Saints, Jemimah Woodbridge of Youthscape, and Matt Cooper of 31:8. There is just so much good practical advice crammed into the pages of this book. To get your copy, go to Grove Books, where you can order Youth Ministry online as a print copy with free postage or as a PDF. There are many, many more great Grove books applying the Bible to a wide variety of situations in the church and the world. They're written by authors who know what they're writing about. Grove Books are bite-sized publications that you can really get your teeth into. Goodbye for now. Hope to see you again soon.